Like and subscribe to Karoline Now, where we expose the powerful forces that shape American politics. Cal Morgan brings you the unfiltered truth behind closed doors and 30,000 feet in the air. Join our community of truth seekers who refuse to be manipulated by political elites and compromised media. Hit that notification bell to witness the next political firestorm unfold. The aluminum hull of the government aircraft cut through cloud cover at 30,000 feet, its occupants unaware of the storm brewing within. White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt sat reviewing briefing papers when her secure phone vibrated with an encrypted message. Her face, previously relaxed, transformed as she read, jaw tightening, eyes narrowing with recognition of what was at stake. The message was clear. A whistleblower in Iowa, Anna Harper, possessed documents that would shatter the carefully crafted media narrative against the administration. Evidence of collusion, manipulation, fabrication, the entire architecture of lies exposed in black and white. But Harper was being hunted. The window was closing. Leavitt's aide Sophia watched with growing concern as her boss abruptly stood, determination hardening her features. The press secretary moved with purpose down the narrow aisle, past startled staffers and Secret Service agents, whose trained eyes registered the sudden shift in atmosphere. "We need to divert to Cedar Rapids immediately," Leavitt announced as she entered the cockpit, her voice carrying the full weight of presidential authority. National security priority. Captain Mark Thompson, decorated Air Force veteran with thousands of flight hours, didn't turn from the controls. "That won't be possible, Madam Secretary." The cabin air seemed to crystallize. Thompson's refusal, calm, practiced, absolute, hung between them like an undetonated explosive. Secret Service agents shifted their stance imperceptibly, hands hovering closer to concealed weapons as the aircraft continued its predetermined course. "That wasn't a request, Captain," Leavitt replied, her voice dropping an octave. "That was a direct order." Thompson finally turned, his eyes meeting hers with unsettling resolve. "I understand, ma'am, and my answer remains the same." In that suspended moment, as confused glances darted between staff members and the tension coiled like a spring, Karoline Leavitt realized with cold clarity that this was no routine flight. Someone had gotten to Thompson first, someone who would go to extraordinary lengths to ensure that Anna Harper's evidence never saw the light of day. And now, at 30,000 feet above American soil, the battle for truth had become a dangerous game of chess where every piece was already in motion. Intuition sharpened by years in Washington's pressure cooker rarely failed Karoline Leavitt. The cabin air grew heavy with unspoken tension as she studied Captain Thompson's face, the slight muscle twitch beneath his left eye, the calculated neutrality in his voice. These weren't the signs of a loyal officer following protocol. "Who gave you those orders, Captain?" Leavitt demanded, her voice cutting through the ambient hum of engines. Thompson's gaze remained fixed on the instrument panel. "Standard flight procedure, ma'am." A lie. Thompson was good, but not good enough. Without breaking eye contact, Leavitt reached for the secure satellite phone. "Get me the flight logs at a direct line to command," she instructed Sophia, who moved with the efficiency of someone who understood the stakes. Minutes stretched like hours as Leavitt scrolled through classified security protocols. There it was, Thompson's name, buried in a list he should never have appeared on. The revelation hit her with physical force. The man controlling their aircraft was compromised. "Initiate Safeguard Protocol Delta," Leavitt whispered into the secure line, her mind already processing contingencies, calculating moves and countermoves. If necessary, she was prepared to neutralize the cockpit, whatever it took to reach Iowa, to reach truth. Thompson's voice crackled through the intercom, any pretense of cooperation abandoned. "That won't help you, Ms. Leavitt." The aircraft suddenly lurched violently, sending unprepared staffers sprawling. Oxygen masks dropped as the cabin depressurized briefly before stabilizing at a steeper angle. "I've locked manual controls," Thompson announced, his voice now tinged with cold certainty. "You won't be reaching Iowa today, you won't be reaching anywhere." Sophia's eyes widened with terror, but Leavitt's narrowed with resolve. In the sudden chaos, papers spiraling through the cabin, alarms blaring, Secret Service agents reaching for weapons, the press secretary remained eerily calm. This wasn't merely obstruction, this was confirmation. Someone powerful enough to compromise a military pilot was desperate to keep Anna Harper's evidence buried. As the struggle for the aircraft intensified, a more profound battle line was being drawn, one that would determine whether buried truths would finally surface or remain forever in darkness. At 30,000 feet, with the ground controllers now asking increasingly urgent questions about their erratic flight path, the war for America's soul had found its unexpected battlefield. 3,000 miles from Leavitt's airborne standoff, in a steel and glass facility overlooking Seattle's rain-slicked streets, Olivia Harper watched digital flight paths with calculated satisfaction. The government jet's erratic course confirmed what millions of dollars had purchased: absolute control. "Right on schedule," she murmured, manicured fingers tapping against polished mahogany. The empire she'd built, a pyramid of influence brokers, compromised journalists, and political puppets, faced its first genuine threat. A whistleblower with irrefutable evidence waited in Iowa, evidence that could unravel years of meticulous manipulation. Back on the aircraft, Nathan Brooks leaned toward Leavitt, voice barely above a whisper. "Our contact disappears at sunset. With them goes everything. The forged memos, the coordinated smear campaign, the proof of editorial manipulation across 17 news outlets." His eyes reflected the gravity their situation demanded. "Without those documents, we're just spreading conspiracy theories." Leavitt's jaw tightened with cold determination. "Then we take this plane back. By force if necessary." Her words held no theatrical bravado, only the steel resolve of someone who had glimpsed the machinery of deception and refused to look away. Throughout the cabin, the atmosphere had transformed. Young staffers who had boarded expecting routine government business now sat in tense silence. Sophia clutched her tablet to her chest, lips moving in soundless prayer. Ethan, the college intern who'd joined the administration 3 weeks prior, stared out the window at cloud formations that suddenly seemed ominous. None had signed up for this, a mid-air confrontation with forces powerful enough to compromise military command structures. Yet each understood, with growing clarity, that their diverted flight represented something far more significant than delayed schedules or missed meetings. "If we fail," Leavitt said, her voice carrying through the cabin's hushed atmosphere, "it won't just be our careers. It will be the public's right to unmanipulated truth." As the jet continued its unauthorized course, banking away from Iowa's critical revelation, the battle lines of America's most consequential information war were being drawn at 30,000 feet, not with bullets or bombs, but with encrypted communications, compromised loyalty, and the fierce determination of those who recognized that sometimes democracy's greatest battles occur far from ballot boxes or legislative chambers. In the sealed sanctum at the aircraft's rear, Karoline Leavitt hunched over a satellite phone, its encryption protocols the last barrier between exposure and annihilation. Static crackled like distant gunfire before clearing to reveal a voice fragile with fear, yet resolute in purpose. "The documents are real," whispered Anna Harper, from her precarious shelter within an Iowa library's forgotten corner. Her words carried the weight of career suicide and, worse, potential erasure. "They prove everything. 17 news outlets, coordinated talking points, manufactured evidence. They've been systematically dismantling public trust in the administration through calculated deception." Leavitt's knuckles whitened around the secure device. Outside the reinforced door, the government jet continued its unauthorized trajectory, each mile widening the gap between truth and its revelation. "They're watching me," Harper continued, her voice fracturing under pressure. "I've moved 3 times today. The library closes at sunset, and I have nowhere else to go." A brief silence followed, filled only by shallow breathing. "There is no backup plan, Ms. Leavitt. If you don't land soon, both these documents and I will disappear. Permanently." The abruptness of the disconnection hit Leavitt like physical force. One moment, the whistleblower's labored breathing. The next, digital silence. Leavitt stared at the dead device, a final click echoing in her mind with finality. She rose from her crouched position, transformation visible in her bearing. What had begun as professional obligation had crystallized into moral imperative. Her eyes, when they met those of the agents assembled in the narrow space, contained something that transcended political calculation, the cold fire of democratic necessity. "Get me into that cockpit," she ordered, voice steady despite the aircraft's constant vibration. "Whatever it takes, whatever protocol you have to break. The pilot has been compromised, and we are now the last line between America and those who would manipulate her through controlled narrative." Thousands of feet below, illuminated screens across the nation displayed carefully curated stories, each pixel a particle in the elaborate machinery of perception management. And in that moment, with sunset approaching over the Iowa horizon, the fate of information integrity hung not on algorithms or editorial boards, but on whether a diverted government aircraft could be reclaimed by those who recognized that truth, once buried, rarely resurfaces without sacrifice. The sealed government aircraft had become a battleground of wills, with democracy itself hanging in the balance. Karoline Leavitt, the administration's voice to the world, now faced the most primal challenge of her career, breaking through literal barriers to rescue a nation from manipulation. Outside the reinforced cockpit door, Leavitt's team worked frantically, their collective expertise meeting the cold reality of a system designed to prevent exactly what they needed to accomplish. Security protocols, once their ally, now imprisoned them in the cabin as Thompson maintained his treacherous course. "Standard overrides aren't working," an agent reported, desperation edging his voice. The cockpit sealed tight. It was then that Ethan, a young technician with anxious eyes but steady hands, stepped forward. "There's another way," he said, indicating a maintenance panel beneath their feet. "A technical passage for the wiring systems. It leads directly under the cockpit floor." Leavitt surveyed the narrow opening. A metal throat barely wide enough for human passage. Without hesitation, she removed her blazer. The most powerful woman in the administration would now crawl through the aircraft's innards like a soldier in trenches. "Ma'am, I should go first," offered Agent Larson. "No time for protocol," Leavitt replied, already lowering herself into darkness. The passage embraced her with cold steel indifference. Her designer dress caught and tore against metal seams as she inched forward, hands scraping against sharp edges, each movement a testament to determination, transcending physical discomfort. Larson followed behind, his flashlight casting eerie shadows through the mechanical labyrinth. Above them, Thompson's voice filtered through the metal ceiling, his confident tone revealing nothing about the rebellion literally beneath his feet. "Maintaining course as instructed," he reported to unseen masters. "No issues with the passengers. I have complete control." Leavitt's bloodied hand found the underside hatch as Thompson's words settled in the space between deception and truth. She nodded to Larson, who positioned himself in the cramped passage. With practiced precision, he threw his weight against the access panel. The sharp crack of breaking metal echoed through the cockpit. Thompson spun around, disbelief contorting his features as Karoline Leavitt rose through the floor like an avenging spirit. Her torn clothing and bloodied hands, a stark contrast to the composed authority in her eyes. "You're not in control here," she declared, her voice carrying the weight of constitutional authority. "I am." In that suspended moment, as pilot and press secretary locked eyes in the pressurized cabin, the balance of power shifted, not just within the aircraft, but potentially for a nation held hostage by orchestrated narratives thousands of feet below. The government aircraft banked sharply toward Iowa, its new trajectory cutting through clouds like destiny itself. In the cockpit, the co-pilot maintained steady hands while Captain Thompson sat restrained, his betrayal now evident to all aboard. Below them, in a small Iowa library bathed in waning sunset light, whistleblower Anna Harper clutched a USB drive, her fingers white with tension. The digital vessel contained enough evidence to collapse a media empire built on calculated deception. The radio crackled with sudden urgency. "Government Flight 1372, this is Regional Command. You are ordered to abort landing. Repeat, abort your approach to Iowa airspace immediately." Karoline Leavitt recognized the voice for what it was. Not legitimate authority, but the desperate reach of shadow forces losing their grip on concealed truths. She exchanged knowing glances with her team. The same invisible hands that had corrupted Thompson were now grasping at administrative channels. "They're in the air traffic system now," Ethan whispered, his technical expertise translating the obvious. Leavitt reached for a secure phone, bypassing traditional protocols. "Governor Evans, Karoline Leavitt, we need emergency clearance at Cedar Valley." Clara Evans' voice came through with crystal clarity. "Granted. I'll have state police secure the perimeter. Whatever's happening, Ms. Leavitt, I trust you more than these sudden federal concerns." As the aircraft began its descent, a convoy of unmarked black SUVs sped toward the library, their tinted windows concealing men with cold expressions and loaded weapons. Anna Harper watched from between the stacks, her heart hammering against her ribcage as shadows lengthened across the parking lot. "Please don't let it end like this," she whispered, clutching both the drive and her faith as armed men in tailored suits approached the building's entrance. Then came the distant thrum of rotor blades, growing louder, salvation or damnation approaching from above. Back on the plane, Leavitt moved through the cabin, not with grandstanding rhetoric, but with the quiet intensity that defined her most authentic moments. She made eye contact with each person aboard, these unexpected participants in history. "We're almost there," she said simply. "Thank you for trusting me." As the wheels prepared to touch American soil, two forces converged on a small-town library, one seeking to extinguish truth, the other to preserve it. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting the final moments of daylight across a battlefield where no shots had yet been fired, but where democracy itself hung in the balance. The government plane descended through wisps of cloud, touching down on Cedar Valley Airport's tarmac with a screech of rubber and resolve. This was no ordinary landing, it was truth making its final approach. Karoline Leavitt hadn't bothered with pleasantries when the convoy of black SUVs pulled up. Her eyes, hard with determination, focused solely on the destination, the library, an unlikely sanctuary for America's most explosive secrets. Inside those walls, Anna Harper backed against bookshelves, cornered by men whose polished shoes and expressionless faces spoke of powers that preferred shadows to sunlight. "Hand over the drive," one demanded, flashlight beam slicing through dust particles like a surgical instrument. "This doesn't have to get complicated." Anna clutched the USB to her chest, years of evidence against her skin. Evidence of collusion, manipulation, propaganda, the architecture of American deception. The library door burst open. Secret Service agents poured through like a cleansing flood, weapons drawn, commands crisp. And through the center of this controlled chaos walked Karoline Leavitt. Not running, not shouting, moving with the inevitable gravity of justice finding its mark. She knelt beside Anna, dust settling around them in the sudden stillness. No grandiose speeches passed between them, only the weight of understanding as the USB drive changed hands. "They tried to buy me," Anna whispered, her voice steadying as Leavitt's presence anchored her. "Then they threatened me. But I knew you'd come, I knew you'd do what's right." Outside, sirens wailed their diminishing protests as a black truck disappeared into Iowa darkness. The agents who had come to silence truth found themselves restrained instead, their authority suddenly paper-thin. Leavitt stood, the small drive in her palm containing enough evidence to rewrite recent history. Around her, the modest library shelves stood as silent witnesses. These repositories of human knowledge, now hosting one more profound chapter. "What happens now?" someone asked. Karoline Leavitt closed her fingers around the drive, securing America's most dangerous truth. "Now," she replied, "we bring light to the darkness." In that moment, in that unremarkable building in unremarkable Iowa, the invisible fulcrum of power shifted. A forgotten journalist had handed a determined public servant the means to save a nation from itself, from the creeping poison of manipulation that had infected its very soul. 30,000 feet above America's heartland, Karoline Leavitt sat bathed in the cold glow of her laptop, fingers moving with deliberate purpose. The evidence was overwhelming. Documents linking media executives, government officials, and global elites in a coordinated campaign to undermine and destroy the administration through manufactured narratives and strategic leaks. Each keystroke carried the weight of revelation as she prepared her address to a nation unaware of the invisible hands that had been shaping their perceptions. The cabin hummed with tension. History waited, holding its breath. "We're broadcasting in 3 minutes, ma'am," Sophia whispered, her voice steady despite the fear etched across her face. Outside the window, storm clouds gathered on the horizon, a fitting backdrop for the tempest Leavitt was about to unleash across American living rooms. Then came the warning. An unidentified aircraft approaching without a transponder, circling with predatory patience. Captain Thompson's voice crackled over the intercom, professional but tinged with unmistakable tension. Leavitt didn't flinch. The camera light blinked red, and she stared into the lens with unwavering resolve. Millions of Americans watched as she held up a small USB drive. "I hold in my hand evidence of a profound betrayal," she began, her voice cutting through the static of national discourse. "The truth was buried, and they tried to stop me from reaching this moment." The radar warning blared through the cabin. The mystery aircraft had launched its attack, a missile streaking through clear sky with deadly purpose. What happened next unfolded in terrible slow motion. Captain Daniel Torres, piloting an escort F-22, broke formation without hesitation. His fighter jet intercepted the missile, absorbing the full force of the explosion meant for Leavitt's plane. The sky erupted in flame and twisted metal, the ultimate sacrifice written in fire against the blue. Silence fell across the government aircraft. The broadcast continued, but now Leavitt's eyes glistened with tears she refused to let fall. Later, as America processed the revelations that would reshape their understanding of power, Leavitt sat alone in the quiet cabin. She dialed a number with trembling fingers. "Mrs. Torres," she said softly to the woman who had just lost her son. "Daniel saved not just my life today, but something far more precious, the truth itself." Her voice broke. "Your son, the proud child of immigrants who loved this country enough to die for its principles. He will not be forgotten, and his sacrifice will not be in vain." Below, America stretched out like a vast, complicated tapestry. The truth was finally free, released into the wild at terrible cost, carried home on wings of sacrifice. The cyber assault intensified as Leavitt's plane approached Washington, a digital barrage targeting servers, attempting to erase what could not be silenced. In the shadow of Captain Torres's sacrifice, Karoline Leavitt rose from her seat with quiet determination, the evidence secure in her grasp. She moved with purpose toward the onboard press room where 5 journalists waited, professionals trained in skepticism, including 2 from networks that had spent months dismantling her credibility piece by piece. "What's she doing?" Sophia whispered to herself as Leavitt pushed open the door. The room fell silent. These journalists expected a controlled statement, filtered truth, managed reality. Instead, Leavitt placed before them unfiltered evidence, raw, unedited, devastating in its clarity. "I'm trusting the American people with this evidence," she declared, her voice steady. "No edits, no bias, just the truth." The broadcast that followed was unlike anything in modern political history. Unfiltered reality streamed into American consciousness. Families gathered around screens. Partisan arguments fell silent. Critics watched with stunned expressions as the architecture of deception crumbled in real time. 26 floors above Seattle's rain-slicked streets, Olivia Harper watched her empire of manipulation collapse. Her phone buzzed incessantly. FBI investigations launching, sealed cases reopened, former allies scrambling for immunity deals. The complex machinery of influence she had constructed across decades was disintegrating within hours. As Leavitt's plane descended toward Washington, spontaneous fireworks illuminated the night sky. Americans lined the streets, waving flags, holding handmade signs reading, "Truth prevails and we trust again." A nation divided was finding common ground in shared outrage and renewed hope. Later, standing before the Jefferson Memorial, its marble columns glowing in the evening light, Karoline Leavitt addressed a wounded but healing nation. "We won't be defined by the evil that tried to divide us," she said, her voice carrying across the reflecting pool. "We'll be remembered for how we rose together." In a Seattle holding cell, Olivia Harper stared at the wall, her empire of lies reduced to ashes. In Arlington National Cemetery, a grieving mother placed flowers on fresh soil, her son's sacrifice ensuring truth would find light. Across America, a nation began the painful but necessary process of rebuilding what matters most, not just institutions, but trust itself. The truth, no matter how deeply buried, will find its way to the light when carried by those courageous enough to face powerful opposition. Karoline Leavitt's journey from a routine flight to a national revelation reminds us that America's strength lies not in comfort but in courage, the willingness to crawl through the darkness, stand firm against corruption, and sacrifice for principles greater than ourselves. In a divided nation, it is not ideology but integrity that rebuilds trust. When we choose truth over tribalism and transparency over power, we reclaim not just our institutions but our shared national soul.